Hello my bookish friends out there in booktube land, and welcome to another episode of Tristan and the Classics. In this video we're going to look at my April reading wrap up. So without further ado, let's dig in, shall we? The first book I read in April was Bleak House by Charles Dickens. My goodness, what a great book. If you've never read Bleak House, read it, because it's a definite 5 out of 5. It's one of those books, I've read it before, and it really can go along with you in life. Now, of course, it's specifically a request for social reform by Dickens, something that he does regularly in his works of literature. The story itself is lampooning or taking a shot at the chancery courts, the legal processes of Victorian England, which dragged on and on and on and ruined people. The courts of law did more on precedent than on justice. In fact, I remember a friend of mine who studied law saying that she was told when she went to her law classes that if you are here to get justice, leave. You are here to learn the law, which is a different thing. That notion was particularly stark in Dickens' day. Chancery Court could drag on for so long. One real case dragged on for 17 years until it exhausted the funds of the estate that was being fought over. And taking that idea, Dickens writes a case called Jarndyce and Jarndyce, in which an estate is up for grabs, and there's two wards of court, Ada and Richard Carston. And they find out that they've got a claim in this huge legal case, Jarndyce and Jarndyce, which would be worth a lot of money. But it's been dragging on and on and on. And it's shrouded in the mysteries of the law. People can't see through the fog of the law unless they're lawyers. And in fact, all the lawyers are constantly wrangling. And anyone that gets in on the case is either ruined by it, or if they're a lawyer, they feel that it's brilliant that they've got in. They think it's a way to climb the ladder. In fact, the case seems to serve the lawyers more than anybody else. And that's how the book starts. You get this brilliant introduction, quite famous, where Dickens repeatedly, I think he uses the word fog 16 times in the opening page, to give you the idea that the law is impenetrably difficult to understand. And every time Chancery Court comes up, often there is fog and mist dwelling outside it as a symbol. In the book, it's like a detective novel. The reason I say it's like a detective book, though, is because all the information that all of the characters need is there at the beginning of the book. They don't know it, but all of it is already available to them. However, through the book, instead of this happens, which leads to this, which leads to this, like a lot of classically plotted stories, rather than specific events, it's things come to light in people's lives. And there's a great cast in this. There are a lot of different characters, and they all have their own little issues. So we've mentioned Ada and Richard. Well, they're wards of court. Now, the person, their guardian, is a man called John Jarndyce, who warns them not to get caught up in this case. It will ruin you. And Richard, he can't help but start thinking of himself being a wealthy gentleman if this case is settled in his favour. John Jarndyce is always saying, let it go, my boy, let it go. And he's one of the noblest, friendliest people in literature. With him is Esther Summerfield. Now, she is one of the narrators, and she is, some people find her annoying because she's almost perfect. She's always talking about how she helps people. But she stands really for goodness in the book, and for what is right and proper and kindly, because the law is clearly unkind here, but it's not just the law. As you go along, you have this unfolding story of how the wards of court fall in love with each other, how the law drags them down, but then you get other people's stories. There's a Lady Dedlock. I mean, what a great name. Who lives a boring life. She is the the top fashionista in the world. People want to be in her company wherever she holds a party. You know, you are someone if you were there. And through this character, Dickens puts the law on one side and the aristocratic, fashionable world on the other side. And he shows that the institutions themselves are very mundane and they grind people down. There's nothing to them. He's really lampooning the institutions of Victorian society which do nothing for the common people. The law serves itself, the aristocrats live in a different world, and Lady Dedlock has a dark secret in her past which begins to unfold through the story. I'm not going to give any spoilers here. Another character comes in, Tulkinghorn. He is a lawyer he's a menace. He doesn't do anything particularly bad, but he has all the secrets of the aristocrats in his brain. They all discuss things with him. But you can see that he can never break into the upper echelons, and you can sense an undercurrent of jealousy. However, amongst all of the array, the panoply of different characters, all with their brilliant names, you've got Crook, great name, Snagsby, the stationer, who is stationer for the lawyers. Putting that word snag on the law, you know, it catches people. You have Conversation Kenge, another lawyer. Then you've got Mrs. Jellyby and Miss Pardiggle, who she's interested in giving foreign aid to people in Africa, whereas her own family is falling to pieces. But sitting at the centre of the whole story is a little street sweeper called Joe. He is not, and at the same time is, the main character of the whole book. He's not the main character because he doesn't seem to have any particular plot. And we're not totally interested in what he's doing. He's not heading anywhere, he's not desiring anything, he's not even discovering anything about himself. Yet he's the central figure because all the institutions of Victorian society swirl around him, but doing nothing for poor Joe, the street sweeper. And it's through Joe that Dickens sort of pokes in the eye all the different institutions that London have around them, and their hypocrisy and their failing to actually render justice or help in any way, shape or form. So, an absolutely brilliant book. I've just given you an amuse-bouche of the depth of what this book has, and I really recommend that you read it. Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Can I just say at this point, if you love classic literature and you like to dig into books and get value and meaning out of them beyond just the surface level, hit the subscribe button and ring the bell for all notifications so that you don't miss any of the deeper book reviews or any of the videos we go through on this channel. Anyway, back to the books. The second book I read this month was Epitaph of a Small Winner by Machedo de Assis. He's a Brazilian writer from the 19th century, and wow, this made me laugh. It really did. You may have seen my other video, a book haul, in which I said I'd got this book and was looking forward to reading it. It did not disappoint at all. Wow. Just wow. A great, great book. It's full of small chapters. There are 161 chapters in this book, but it's only 210 pages long. And it's so well put together. I'm struggling even to know how to sum this up for you. It's narrated first person by the main character, Bras Cubas, and he details his life from the perspective of being dead. Not that he's a writer who has now expired, as he says, but he is actually expired and has now begun to write. He's able to look back on his life from the place of death, where he's not in a rush to say anything. And what he does is he just takes out not a blow-by-blow plot of his life, because life is not plotted. And I think this is what's so brilliant about Assis's way of writing this. Our lives don't follow a plot. You may have the ambition to run a business or to visit Australia or whatever it may be, but your whole life, have you got a plot for it? Do you know how it's going to work out? Well, no one does. And so being a narrator who is on the other side, has died, and is looking back on his life, he's just looking through some significant moments in his life, some of them very short, and analysing them. They're the things that he remembers. It's where the value of his life sort of condenses into little pockets. He starts with being a young lad, gives his background, and he mentions like little anecdotal things, such as his father, who is a public figure, having a party, and another public figure is cavorting with someone who is not his wife in the bushes, a young girl. And he talks about how he runs in and sees them and then runs out and tells everybody at the party that they're kissing in the bushes. Not seeing as a little boy how much tragedy or strain that would put on other people's lives. And all the way through the book, that's the message. That life is full of odd twists and turns that cause no end of grief. Even the things that we enjoy, the things that we hope to see a lot of in our lives, can be scuppered in the blink of an eye. And nothing is set for sure. He talks about planning to elope with a girl called Marcella, but she's a gold digger. However, she's beautiful, and he talks about his youthful lust and love for her. But it's interesting, later in the book, in one of the little chapters, he goes to a shop where he sees Marcella again, but years have passed. And how life is not just this static process, that the person you see when you're young, who you admire and look up to, might either become better later on, as some of his schoolmates, he meets them later, they've improved themselves. Others have really let themselves down. He also talks about the anxiety and the trouble that a lot of people face when it comes to actual love of a person. What is immorality? He explores that idea, but he does not do it in a very philosophical way. In fact, there's a quote in this book where it says, you want to tell me your philosophy? Well, let's first talk about dinner. That's his attitude towards life. It's dry wit. It's quite macabre at times because it doesn't shy away from death. It doesn't shy away from horrible subjects. And all the way through, Brass Cubas writes it with a half smile. And it does have you chuckling. You'll relate to it. A lot of people will say, oh, a Brazilian author is going to be full of palm trees or exotic animals or characters, carnival or favelas. It's got none of that. It reads like one of the most modern books I have ever read. It is spectacularly good. And I highly recommend you go out and get this book. It is just perfect. I don't know how this book could be improved upon. There's one chapter in it where he says, here it is, look, how I did not become a minister of state. I don't know if you can see this. It's just a bunch of dots because, well, he didn't know how he didn't become a minister of state. That was just his life. At the end of the book, he comes to a conclusion that he almost holds a divine accounting, a bank balance of his life. The good that he did, the bad that he did. And what did his life amount to? And he comes to the conclusion that he came off as a small winner in life because of one single thing that he didn't do. And by not doing this one thing, he thinks he did something good enough to come out a victor in life. What is that thing? You'll have to read it. I will certainly be doing a full book review on this book. As indeed, by the way, I'll be doing one on Bleak House because it's just too good not to do a full review on. So that was book number 2, Epitaph of a Small Winner by Machedo. Assis. The third book I read this month was Anna Karenina by Leo Tolstoy. Can I just say, I have had the most magnificent month of reading when it comes to quality of books. Anna Karenina, wow. I mean, Bleak House, was brilliant. Epitaph of a Small Winner, exceptional. Anna Karenina, just... I can't say this is a better book than Bleak House. They're totally different. But Anna Karenina is beloved the world over for a reason. It is such a great... I can't call it a story, because it just doesn't read like a story. Actually, Matthew Arnold made a very famous quote about Leo Tolstoy. He said he doesn't write novels. Reading Tolstoy is not like reading a novel, it's reading a piece of life. And I think he was talking about Karenina when he said that. And it really, really is. If you read Anna Karenina, or you want to read it again, think of that quote by Matthew Arnold, that you are reading a piece of life, not a novel. Because plotting this book, it doesn't read like it was plotted at all. You can feel the struggle and the strain of the author in this book. In fact, Tolstoy took a long time to write it. He went sometimes several weeks, even over a month, several months, in fact, without even writing any of it, because he struggled. If it wasn't for the fact that he had to write it for a serial and get it completed for a newspaper, it's likely that Tolstoy would never have finished the book. He would have happily given up on it. But there is so much of himself and his life in this book. One of the chief things that he is looking at is the topic of adultery and loving someone whom you are not married to, the consequences of adultery. Also, it's thrown into the mix of modernity versus the old pastoral life. Modernity in this is symbolised by the railway. A lot of the most significant things happen at the railway station or on a train. Not that the train figures a lot through the book, but there's little references to the railways whenever something of meaning comes up in the book. The book itself starts with someone who has cheated on his wife, and it has that most famous opening paragraph that every happy family is the same, but each unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. And it starts with this affair which causes the wife to wonder whether she should get a divorce or not. And of course, divorce is not easy to get in the 19th century, let alone in Russia, where the Orthodox Church was so powerful. It wasn't the state, but the Orthodox Church that decided whether you could get a divorce. Also, the stigma attached to it. And we are introduced shortly after to Anna Karenina herself. She is this bewitching character. She is beautiful. She has this dark hair. She knows how to handle herself in society. She's almost like Lady Dedlock. She's sort of at the top. And a bit like Lady Dedlock, she seems to be trapped in a sort of a swirl of boredom. And she has a child. She's married to a man who's progressing through the ranks in the ministry. But then she meets Count Vronsky on a train or at a train station. And things take a turn. She feels something towards him, but thinks, no, I'm not going there. And then lo and behold, she's holding some kind of soiree or going to some fashionable event, and Vronsky is there again. Now, Vronsky has already shown himself interested in another young girl to court her, but once he meets Karenina, they get together in an adulterous relationship. This is not a spoiler because that's quite well known of the story. But to say it moves like a story would be totally wrong. Because there's two main characters. There's a host of major characters, but there's two main characters. One is Anna Karenina, and the other one is Levin. Levin, he also is aristocratic, but he lives in the country and he looks after his farm and he wants to improve farming and the state of affairs in Russia. He's got a problem with some of the nihilistic outlooks, even the capitalist outlook. And he prefers the old way of things. He thinks that focus upon the land and the peasants, although serfdom has now been done away with in Russia, and that was a big issue at the time, how the land should continue to be developed, because Russia is a vast, vast place, even today. A lot of it, most of it, is still uninhabited. And that used to occupy the time of many a common Russian, that their job was to continually cultivate the land of barren Russia. Levin is sort of interested in that, and he's charmed to a degree by the peasant's life. Some of the most beautiful writing in this book is not when it comes to Anna Karenina herself. It's not the loves, the various loves that are going on through the book amongst, I don't know, it must be over 100 characters. But whenever Tolstoy talks about the countryside, it's just beautiful. And there's a scene where the peasants are cutting the hay and Levin gets involved, and you just drift there. You are there. You see the contrast between a sort of a simpler life, a rural life, and this modernity that is happening in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the big cities, which are getting ever more frenetic and where all high society is. And there's this contrasting of the two, which is quite a common theme across all of Europe at this time period, the 19th century. But Tolstoy grabs it in a unique way. I'll tell you what Tolstoy reminds me of. Bread. Good, a fine, rustic, but properly cooked bread. Not a brioche, not a sourdough, not dense, but a bread that has been carefully made and handled with love. Ask any top chef about cooking bread, and they will say it's one of the most sacrosanct things. Bread is so basic, but is so beautiful and brilliant, and it's almost the heart of humanity, bread. It's what keeps us alive. And Tolstoy's Anna Karenina is like a farmhouse round loaf with a beautiful crust, a scent to savour. I think if you've read it, you'll know what I'm talking about, but I must sound like an idiot to some of you. The book is so well worth a read, but it's a quiet book. It's not an Alexander Dumas. It doesn't gallop along. It doesn't swashbuckle. Its temperature does fluctuate, but not through extreme colds to sort of raging heats of emotion. It's a piece of life. Whole section. And when you read it like that and enjoy it for that, there is an awful lot to learn inside this book. Another book I will be doing an in-depth review of, and that somewhat terrifies me because what a large book, and there's so many threads. It's going to be interesting. I'm still trying to work out all my thoughts on this book, but it is fantastic. It's terrific monument of literature. This is truly a great classic. The last book that I read in April was non-fiction, and it was excellent. I couldn't get my hands on a hard copy. It's quite a rare book to get hold of, actually. And it's by E.M. Forster, he who wrote Howard's End. It's called Aspects of the Novel. And E.M. Forster has got a lot of great critical insights into different authors and different works of literature. But this book is just about the novel itself. And through the chapters he gives you an introduction. Then he starts looking at the story, just story itself. And he sums it up quite good, story. He says that story is simply what's going to happen next. The reader should always be asking, and what happens next? And what happens next? He says that's the story in its fundamental form. The example he uses is Scheherazade in Arabian Nights. If you know the story, she's telling a story to keep the king occupied. And because she doesn't want to die the next day, she doesn't quite finish the story. And when the sun comes up, the king wants to know what happens next. And so he lets her remain alive for the next night. So he says that is fundamentally what a story is. What happens next? And he says the only rule of thumb is the reader either wants to know what happens next and cares, or doesn't care about what happens next, in which case your story falls apart. And this is where he starts, but then begins to develop, because he goes into people then, the different characters that you have, the inner lives that people occupy. Then he talks about what makes plot. How is plot different from story? He gives an example of the difference between plot and story by saying that plot is the why behind a story. So a story might be a child went and stole the apples and got in trouble. The plot would be the child went and stole the apples and braved the trouble because he needed to feed his family. This is plot compared to story. And he expounds on all of that. Then he looks at fantasy. Excellent chapter. And then he has this interesting chapter on preaching versus prophesying. That is a chapter you will have to go over and over to get your head around. It's one of those, you read it, and then later on at night you think, oh, that's what he meant. He talks about different authors. Some preach they have a deliberate moral, and they can't refrain from telling you what the moral is. George Eliot is sort of accused of doing this quite a bit. But then he talks about the prophetic person, and their writing sort of raises multiple issues. It foresees events. It almost prophesies a potential outcome, but it doesn't tell you what the moral is. It doesn't tell you what to believe. You have to draw the conclusion based on the picture it's presenting of the future. It's a very indefinite ending. In fact, in Crime and Punishment, because he talks about Dostoevsky being like a prophetic author, that's why some people criticise the epilogue to Crime and Punishment. Some say, well, it ties up the book. But by doing that, Dostoevsky gives you his moral and becomes a preacher. Whereas where the book of Crime and Punishment really should end, just before the epilogue, is masterful. And it leaves it all for the reader. It's quite an experience. It's like a prophetic dream that you've just been through. Speaking of story, Forster mentions how story is written in time. Normally from a beginning to an end. Sometimes it chops back and forward, but it will always be trapped within time. But he explains to us the importance of the value of what is being said in the story. And if you're a writer, this is quite insightful. He says the thing that may conveniently be called value is something which is measured not by minutes or hours, but by intensity. So that when we look at our past, it does not stretch back evenly, but piles up into a few notable pinnacles. And when we look at the future, it seems sometimes a wall, sometimes a cloud, sometimes a sun, but never does the future look like a chronological chart. Now, isn't that an exceptional insight into literature? In fact, I've mentioned a book that I read last month which fell into that, Epitaph of a Small Winner. It is not a chronological chart, it is a matter of intensity. The author, Bras Cubas, when I say the author, the narrator, Bras Cubas, when he begins writing from beyond the grave, he says, where do I start? Do I start with my death or do I start with my life? The story will be in time. However, the small chapters are just those intense moments of value where everything in his life crammed up into a pinnacle, as Forster says. And that's where we resonate with this book, but with all books. It's those intense moments of meaning that almost create the direction of a story, the flow. It keeps us interested. So there's just one example of the insights that you might get from reading this book, Aspects of the Novel by E.M. Forster. If you want to sort of have an appreciation of what to look for in literature, I would recommend getting this book. Well, there you have it. Those were my 4 books that I read last month. They were Bleak House by Charles Dickens. Rave review. Read that book. Get that book. That's a book you should have in hardback. Epitaph of a Small Winner. Brilliant book. I mean, the most modern classic novel I've ever read. It's just so fresh and up to date. Then there was Anna Karenina, A Piece of Life. It cannot be summed up better than that. A piece of life, or for me, a piece of bread. Well-cooked bread. And last of all, we had aspects of the novel by E.M. Forster. I could give you about 200 citations from that book, which are just incredibly profound, very insightful, but I won't do it because this video would go on for hours and hours and hours. Anyway, I hope that you've enjoyed this video. If you have, give a subscribe and a like, and I will see you on the next episode of Tristan and the Classics. I wish you joy in your reading.